Well, Frank, it's just a pleasure to have you here. I mean, the ISIR board was doing cartwheels when they heard that you agreed to be our distinguished contributor interview this year. And it's so nice to have you here. It's a little different for me because Frank and I have been friends for years. But I think this will go well. And I just have to start with, how does a suboptimal student from Trinidad get to where you are now? I mean, you really weren't impressive when you were young, Frank. So maybe you could tell us.
Well, that's a very hard question to answer in front of intelligence researchers. But I think suboptimal performance in school doesn't necessarily translate into a lack of potential or ability. I have to say that I did pretty well in elementary school, and I was one of 500 students of about the 10,000 that take the entrance exam into secondary school, who got the $24 scholarship that they gave, and I got into the top school for boys. But I think at that time I was quite convinced about my intellect and didn't feel I needed to do any work. And so in secondary school, I devoted my attention to music and spent much less time on classroom studies, which manifested in lower and lower grades the higher I got. In Trinidad, your final exam grade is your grade for the year. So you could get A's all year, but if you did a C on the final, that's what you got. So you'd study for the final, you didn't do much over there, and you studied for the final, and then you got that grade. But as I said, if you don't study, as you get higher up, there's more to study at the end of the year, and so I didn't learn the lesson well enough. I attended classes most of the time, so I think I got the information. I just couldn't put it together at the end, and my mother had a lot to do with me turning it around, because both of my parents were from little fishing villages, as in Mom's village is fewer than 500 people, and both of them, I think, ended up much higher. My father ended up being a policeman, and my mother retired as an elementary school principal. And when I got my A-level grades, the ones I referred to on Wednesday, and that you all can see if you all read that article, I passed all the subjects, and my father, who had just gone to second grade, was delighted. He was holding a toast. He asked, he's called the whole family together, the neighbors, drinking a toast. Frank has passed all of his exams. And my mother's response was, I have nothing to celebrate. Frank did not do his best. And so I smiled blithely, pretending I didn't care about what she said. But I think my mom was the ultimate psychologist. She knows that anger trumps guilt. And so the fact that she made it so casually, the knife was in there. And I vowed she would never be able to say that again. And so when I went to college, I actually tried to live up to that vow. And again, I was lucky enough to have, I think, the psychology department at Western and the English department was where I started. I was an English major first. Was absolutely wonderful. I would not trade my education in Canada for the world.
Mm-hmm. And it really prepared you for Berkeley. But how did you select Berkeley to do your graduate training?
Well, everything was a bit serendipitous. I had done, when I finished my master's in Canada, I went back to Trinidad, and I had decided I liked research, and so I wanted to do research. But, so I was going to go back to Canada and do educational psychology, which is what I'd done my master's degree in. My best friend from secondary school was at Berkeley at law school, and we were speaking on the phone, and he said, are you applying to Berkeley? And I said, no, I'm just applying to schools back in Canada. And he sent me the Berkeley catalog. And I read about school psychology, which had both the clinical training and the research training. And my ultimate intention was to go back to Trinidad, and I thought, we don't have this at all. And so school psychology would be a better option. And at that time, Canada didn't have a lot of school psychology programs. So I ended up applying to school psychology programs. And at Berkeley, I got a teaching assistantship. So I got more money there than other places, and so that's how I ended up there. It was purely by accident.
Mm-hmm. Did you have an advisor in mind when you went there, or just the reputation of the institution?
Just the reputation of the institution, and not even that so much, that the fact my best friend was there, I knew somebody, because this is pre the internet. And so, I really didn't know about Berkeley in the sense. I think I learned about Berkeley's reputation when I went to my first conference and talking to other grad students, and they said, where do you go to school? And I said, Berkeley. And they said, you're at Berkeley? But I had no sense, I think, of its stature. we knew the privates. You knew of Stanford, you knew of Harvard and Yale and Princeton, but those are the names that you knew.
I see.
In Trinidad, yes.
I see. And then when you were at Berkeley, how did you develop a research program? I mean, to prepare yourself for an academic position?
Right. Yeah, I'll credit my advisor and many of the faculty there with that. My advisor was Nadine Lambert. She had a wonderful research agenda. She did work on dropouts, ADHD, and actually mental retardation. And she was always big on the idea of a research agenda. Indeed, when I got an interview for a job, she reminded me, remember, you're talking about your research agenda, not your dissertation. A good thing, since I had just only had pilot data at the time I interviewed. But that idea of starting with a theory and coming up with questions and then following those questions along. And so that's something that I think she pushed. At Berkeley, we have what are called research groups. And so we met every week. It's kind of like a lab and stuff because, and we share our work, we get feedback on it and stuff, even though we're doing different projects. And she also allowed you to pursue your own agenda because she was doing ADHD research by the time I started at Berkeley and I wanted to study dropouts. And she allowed me to do that, but then there's always the pushing, asking you to, have you thought about X? What about Y? And so really and truly it was, I was lucky to have magnificent training.
Mm-hmm. And then, you said you wanted to get back to Trinidad, but you ended up at Penn State.
Right. So it became very clear over the course of the 6 years at Berkeley that if I went back to Trinidad, that there was nothing I wouldn't be able to do research. There were no psychology courses at the university. I probably could work in the Ministry of Education, but I'd be in an administrative position supervising a department, and there were no psychologists. At least maybe there were a few in private practice, but there was none in the public sector at all. So I decided that I'd try to help Trinidad, but it would make sense if I was doing research, I could do research in Trinidad and collect data, for example, and use it. But, so still get to help Trinidad.
Sure.
And do that. And particular case, because when I went back after completing my master's degree, and so let me back up a bit. I got a Commonwealth scholarship that paid for my junior and senior years. So Canada and Trinidad are both members of the British Commonwealth. And so I was able to get a Commonwealth scholarship from my junior and senior year, which means I owed Trinidad 2 years of service. And so when I finished my undergraduate degree, the university gave me a scholarship to do my master's. And I begged in Trinidad, and I said, you're going to get somebody more qualified, and they let me stay on. And so I stayed on for an additional year to do the master's degree. And then I get back to Trinidad, and they'd forgotten that I was coming and coming back. And I was offered a teaching position in a rural area about a 2-hour drive from my house for 3 months, replacing somebody who was on maternity leave. So, I mean, so it's very clear that there was no job for you in the context of Trinidad with a research degree. And so ultimately, I thought, I'll stay in the United States and I'll be able to help Trinidad. And I have been able to do that, which I'm very pleased to say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you finished your PhD and you took what research program to Penn State to develop?
So I started with two things. My dissertation was on hope as a protective factor for students who are at risk for dropping out. And in my dissertation study, I wanted students who were at risk, so I actually had a group of students at a continuation high school, sort of equalizing risk in some sense. And I also did it statistically. And I looked at students, I collected data on 3 groups of students. A group of students who were currently at the school, a group of students who had dropped out from that school, the continuation high school, in the previous 2 years, and a group of students who had graduated from the continuation high school in the previous 2 years. And my hypothesis was that self-esteem was the big construct at the time in California, that I didn't think self-esteem was actually the variable, the protective factor. I thought it was actually hope in the future based on Erickson's theory, Erik Erikson. And so I looked, so for my dissertation, I did the retrospective study, and in fact, school climate came out as a factor, and self-esteem didn't play out. But 2 years later, I went back, and for the students who were in school, I looked at who had dropped out and who had graduated. And in the prospective study, hope in the future is the one that played out. So it supported the hypothesis. I also had data, a number of data sets, pilot studies and so forth that I had not published that provided support for those things. So those are things I started publishing. At the same time, I had gotten interested in gifted and talented because I had to work on campus, and there was this gifted and talented program that I started teaching in. And I was struck by the differences between the students in this program. If they thought they were going to get less than an A, they wanted, what can I do, extra credit, so forth, versus students who are at risk and who are getting a D, and I'm trying to push them to get a C, and they're like, why would I do that? So why would I work harder? And so I was interested in whether the factors that acted as protective factors, hope among them, were also protective factors for the students, because my dissertation study. So I've shown in a few studies that in fact, things like expectations for the future and so forth, the academically talented students and the dropouts, the resilient ones, the ones who don't drop out, did not differ on those protective factors. So they acted as protective factors for kids who were at risk, but promotive factors for those who were not at risk. And so self-efficacy and all of those variables, I think, are useful variables. So I started that nascent agenda in looking at the psychosocial factors related to performance at the highest levels.
I see. How many years were you at Penn State?
9. I was at Penn State for 9 years. Yeah.
So you were 9 years studying, and what were your most impactful contributions there? Because whatever they were, they positioned you to get probably the best school psych job in the country at the time, because you came back to Berkeley.
Yes, I came back to Berkeley. I'm not sure it was my impactful research agenda. Actually, it's interesting because I actually know Berkeley, the school psych program at Berkeley uses developmental psychology as its base. Most psychology programs, school psych programs, use behavioral psychology. So all of the finalists were Berkeley graduates, actually. The 4 of us, we knew each other. We met at AERA that year just before we interviewed, and we were all comparing. We know each other quite well. 4
finalists from Berkeley.
Yes. And I'd like to think, I think when I went up for tenure at the time, it's going to sound very small now, but I think I had something like 14 or 15 publications, sort of explicating the idea of these psychosocial factors are mattering. But I also think, again, context, right? So one of the individuals, Arthur Jensen was on our faculty, and in intelligence is not something that, in fact, anybody at Berkeley studies right now, so it's something that, it's like many places, it's fraught. So one of the individuals who was competing against me studied intelligence, and I actually think that ruled him out. I mean, I'm speculating here. Another one was actually one of the earliest graduates of the program. I think he was going to be, he retired a few years later, so I suspect that age ruled him out. Of course, they wouldn't say that. And the third one, who's done a lot of interesting work, had never been in a school psych program. He had done all of his work in social work. So that's his appointments in social work. So I think my work was fine, but I also think I had some other help beyond the actual research agenda that I had. There are context matters. There are also a number of contextual factors that play a role.
So you arrived there after 9 years. Yes. And now it's been a lot of years have passed. When you look at your contributions to the literature now, what are you proudest of? What do you think are your most impactful contributions?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think, when I was going up for full professor, I think it's one of the questions we have to answer at Berkeley, and the response I gave, I think, surprised everybody. I'll give that here. It was in terms of impact, it's not sort of citations and stuff, though. The work that I think I'm proudest of is actually the work that I've done helping Trinidad and Tobago. So one of the things I was able to do is to go back to the Ministry of Education there and convince them. They had asked me to train their counselors who worked in the secondary schools because they had these students who weren't doing well and they thought they needed counseling. And I teach consultation. And after asking a few questions, I realized that, kids who can't read and write, it doesn't matter how much you counsel them, that's not going to solve the problem. That what they needed was skill sets. And so, and then it's fine to teach skill sets, but you really need to work with the system so that students are not getting into secondary school not being able to read and write well. And so I actually convinced the Ministry of Education to engage in a norming process. So it's a small country, 1.3 million people. We actually were able to do a stratified random sample of 700 males and 700 females across the 7 levels of elementary school. We collected data on learning behaviors. We collected data on problem behaviors. We normed 2 teacher rating scales and a parent rating scale so they could diagnose conduct disorders and ADHD and those kinds of things with Trinidad norms. We also used Trinidad reading books, starting with, sort of phonemic awareness measures collected 3 times across the school year, first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, for the years of elementary school so they could look at what were the reading concerns and check and see if our students making progress and so forth. We taught then the guidance officers how to use the guidance officers. We taught them about the data collection. They went out and collected the data. We had our students enter the data. They used it for their dissertations and stuff. But then we did these manuals, taught the guidance officers how to use the manuals so that they then could support the schools that they were supporting, both elementary and secondary. And I think, I recently learned at ARA, in April of this year, I was attending a session and somebody was presenting about some work that they've been doing in the Caribbean and talked about the Trinidad and Tobago model as something that they're thinking about the whole Caribbean adopting. And so I was like, I wonder what model that is. Because I'd done this work, we did this work back in 1998 to 2002. And when I went and spoke to her afterwards, it was the project I had set up in the Ministry of Education that they were using as one of the models potentially for the Caribbean region. The Caribbean Development Bank actually had a meeting just about a month ago or so where, this was discussed. So I think that work is perhaps the most impactful work that I've done. Now, there have been several publications that have come out of that work, but many of them, I'm like trailing author because I don't do reading research and that kind of thing. So the people whose scales I used, they allowed us to use the scales for free in Trinidad. The Trinidad and Tobago manual has, these scales, the copyright is voided for Trinidad and Tobago Ministry of Education, so they can use it down there without paying for every protocol. My colleague Paul McDermott at the University of Pennsylvania, we used several of his measures. So he and his students really have been the lead who've been doing a lot of this work and stuff. And so I've gotten publications out of it, quite a few, but it's not been the work that I've been doing as the mainstay for my research.
I see, yeah. And what is that primarily now? Is it your research on hope? Is it the identity research?
Well, it's a constellation of things.
Yeah.
So I think at the heart of it, I do a lot of research at different areas, but adolescents are basically most of my research is on adolescents, and I look at 3 particular things. I study talented adolescents, and I'm particularly interested in what is it that they have separate from G, where's Tom, going beyond G, that in fact is helpful. We just actually had a paper accepted, I think it's in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, on insider knowledge. So what knowledge do you have as a high school student, that got you into college, what not undergrad, what knowledge gets you from undergrad into, so that, that's the work that led to the development of the talent development mega model, which was published in 2011 and has become our most cited paper. So that work is one set of work that has been going on that I'm quite proud of. But I was also interested in the time constructs as well. And so when I was at Penn State, a student came to me from the Human Development, and she was very interested in time and was coming to convince me that to be on her dissertation committee as an outside member, outside of the college that she was in. And she brought me a paper. She came bearing gifts. She brought me the 1999 paper by Phil Zimbardo, in which he introduced the Zimbardo Time Perspective Inventory. I've always thought, how do you get a blind review when your name is in the title of the manuscript? But that's a separate question. But in any case, she brought me the paper that he had written. I had not seen it. It was in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And I said, well, this is great because his contribution in that paper, Phil's contribution, was that everybody focuses on the future. We study hope, we study optimism, and those kinds of constructs. And we assume that if you're high on a future construct, that means you're low in the present and you're low in the past. And so the Zimbardo Time Perspective Inventory measures past, present, and future attitudes. And so we tried that out in adolescence. I said, I agreed to serve on a committee. We conducted a study with academically talented adolescents and found that the scale didn't work that well. I left and went to Berkeley, stayed on the committee. She graduated and then came to Berkeley as a postdoc with me. And I asked her, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to develop a measure that works for adolescents. Mm-hmm. And so that was in 2005. We started working on that scale. I think the first article came out in 2009. The main validity study came out in 2013. But since that time, it's really taken off in major ways. It's called the Adolescent and Adult Time Inventory. And just last week, we got the Hebrew version accepted. We have a Japanese version, Slovene, Portuguese, German. It's been used in Amharic, Farsi. It's in like 15 different languages now, and we're finding similar patterns and predictions across these different countries. And latent profile analysis is showing us that adolescents and adults have these profiles of time attitudes. So there are some people who are positives. There are some people who are negatives. There are some people who are pessimists. There are optimists and so forth. The interesting thing is that these things are predicting consistently. And they're not just predicting other time constructs like optimism and hope. They're predicting school belonging. They're predicting positive attitudes towards school if you're positive. They're predicting lower perceived stress if you're positive, higher self-esteem. They're predicting less expectation for discrimination in ethnic minority groups. So it seems to be sort of a general lens at which you look at the world. And so that's another set of research that's going on, and sort of taken on a life of its own. As I said, we had no idea it was going to blow up in the way that it did. And the third major area that I studied, I come from a majority black country now. I think we are the second largest group in Trinidad now. East Indians are the largest. So I came to the United States, and this idea of blacks not doing well in school was just not something that I expected. So if you're studying, I took a course, of course, on dropout prevention and school failure and all those kinds of things, and these things kept bubbling up in the literature. And a lot of the theorizing was about identity and how, stereotype threat, in essence, is an identity theory, right? And, a theory that I find also equally compelling is John Ogbu's cultural ecological theory. He's he passed away. He was on the Berkeley faculty, educational anthropologist. And again, another identity theory. But they weren't sort of measuring identity in quite the same way. So again, one of those happenstances, one of those nice circumstances that happened. I arrived at Penn State in 1994 as an assistant professor in school psychology. And William E. Cross Jr. arrived as a full professor in social and personality psychology. And Bill is the author of Negrescence theory. He actually published the first version of it in 1971 when he was a doctoral student at Princeton. And he had published a revision in 91. And then another colleague arrived in 95 who was very familiar with Bill's theory. I didn't know it that well, I had heard of it. And she brought a group of us together and said, we should develop a measure to measure Bill's theory. There was a measure based on the 71 model. The revised model, there was no measure. And so we started a project in 95 to develop a measure to operationalize Negressen's theory. In doing so, we actually changed the theoretical model from a developmental or stage model to an attitudinal model. And we developed a measure that has been very robust in the literature. It's holding up. And it's also been used in Jamaica. I have some studies from Jamaica. And so started to do that work, and again, it's an attitudinal model, and so we're able to look at profiles. They're multiculturalists, assimilationists, and so forth. And while that's not predictive as much of academic outcomes, it's predicting many psychological outcomes, well-being and distress. So there's the people with a self-hatred profile and conflicted profiles are reporting higher depression scores, higher anxiety scores, and so forth, than individuals with assimilationist profiles, multiculturalist profiles. We were able to show, for instance, that a lot of people assume that if you are assimilationist, and the way we define that is sort of putting your national identity, so call me American, not African American, putting your national identity ahead of your ethnic identity, that if you did that, you were self-hating. We were able to show that no, not only is it not self-hating, but actually it's not associated with negative outcomes in the way that the self-hating profile is. And so that work has been going on. And one of my Latino colleagues at Berkeley said, we need a scale like this for Latinos, so because we had developed it for African Americans. And so we started puttering, and I took the lead, and in 2019 we published a version of the scale that can be used with Asian Americans, African Americans, European Americans, Latinos. One of my former advisees has translated it into Spanish, so we haven't validated the Spanish versions yet. But that scale, we've collected data both in the US and in New Zealand. It's working in New Zealand. Maori, the Pacifica, Pakeha, their ethnic groups and stuff. And so that's another set of work that I'm doing. Some of those things, again, multiculturalists report higher school belonging, assimilationists higher school belonging, conflicted, less school belonging. And so we are finding a number of those kinds of patterns that, again, predicting some school outcomes we are seeing in New Zealand. We have some youth data in the United States that we have analyzing right now. And we hope to find the same thing.
Well, that has to be very rewarding to have something cross-culturally robust like that.
Yeah, no, so we've been really, really lucky that, so when we were developing the scales, I think my training in school psychology has been useful because I think lots of the measures that sometimes have been developed in social psychology and social personality and developmental, they pay a lot of attention to theory and not as much to measurement.
Yeah.
But in school psychologists, you are making decisions that are going to have profound impacts on people's lives. And so from my point of view, even when you're developing an attitudinal measure for research, you need the scores to be as robust as possible. And so that's sort of been the mantra when in the scale development work I've done.
Well, the other thing I wonder about with respect to you in school psychology compared to those other disciplines, you know what the trenches are like of humanity. You've seen much more of the range than a lot of people working in those areas. I just wondered the extent to which that contributes to your success in building measures of these things. You know what's out there.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to, for instance, in developing the time inventory, we actually, we came up with 200 and something items. After my research group I think we got it down to something like, I don't know, maybe about 60-something items. Then we did focus groups with adolescents. But not just with adolescents in affluent schools. We went to adolescents in low-income schools and adolescents from ethnic minority groups. In fact, there was one, my postdoc, she's the one who interviewed, we actually had an adolescent who was extremely angry that we were asking about what do you think about your past and stuff, because she had had a really traumatic experience and so forth. And so this idea, so we had the responses of those adolescents informed the final items that we actually kept on the measure. So I think that that's one way in which that has been useful. I think the other thing is that in the work here and the work that you do, I think as I think I said before, we often focus on this, this elite, even if we're just taking the top 10%. But when we think about the people who are populating much of the professions in society, it's beyond that top 10% and stuff, and they don't get as much study, right? I think Tom mentioned that in his talk as well. That we need, I think, to be we study the kids who are at risk, we study the kids who are at the very top, and that general middle often gets overlooked. And I think that general middle actually needs to get as much attention, because I think ultimately our goal, I'm not one of the people who believes necessarily that we are going to eliminate the achievement gap, but what I think we can do is raise the whole distribution if we were to do sort of gifted education pedagogy for the whole system. So that's the model that I tend to come from, that we really need, think about what it would mean if, putting aside individuals with disabilities, if people at the low end of the achievement gap were proficient, right? Now, when we look at NAEP scores, right, we have 40 to 50% of African Americans and Latinos who are not proficient in reading and mathematics. What if they were, that low end was proficient? So we went from proficient and above. And I think that's what our goal should be. That's what we should be working towards.
Yeah. And so all of this has taken you recently to the Chancellors Award here at Berkeley. I mean, why don't you tell people what that is, and why don't you tell them a little bit about the talk you're required to give for that?
Yeah. Well, Berkeley has, actually it's not that recent, but Berkeley has it's a Chancellors Award for excellence in research, teaching, and service. And it's not in the title, but it's really with an emphasis on diversity, serving diverse populations. And so the process, there's a committee, people are nominated. I guess some of my colleagues nominated me, and I was awarded it. When you get this award, you are actually, it used to come with a $10,000 check that had gone away by the time I got it, but Berkeley doesn't have as much money as it once did. You actually have to you got to give a talk. All of the senior administration is there. In the year that I did it, they've now moved it out of the Chancellor's house, but the Chancellor has a residence on campus. You actually did it at the Chancellor's residence. You get to invite 100 people, so like my siblings came in from New York and so forth, and you really get a chance to give a talk to the upper administration of the campus. And then, of course, many people from your department, are represented there and stuff. Actually, the best thing that happened the day of that talk, which is something is, I was about to go on sabbatical. And so after the talk, I'm mingling with people, and my doctoral students come up to me, and they have some flowers, and they have a card. And so they give me the flowers and the card, and they say, open the card. And I open the card, and there's $350, as in cash. And I'm like, what is this? And the spokesperson for the award said, you work way too hard. When you're in New Zealand, you need to do something fun with this. And you need to send us a picture of you doing something fun with this. And so I actually sent them a picture of me coming through an ice cave. It was not fun, because I'm not a jock. But I had booked a helicopter tour, but the helicopter was too windy for the helicopters to fly over the glacier. So they were only walking tours that day, so I actually ended up doing one of those. But I actually was able to send them a picture of me coming out of the ice cave on the glacier and stuff. So it's actually the screenshot on my laptop. It always reminds me of trying to do right by your students.
That's very nice. That's a sweet story. But you had all the administrators there. So what did you tell them, Fred?
Yeah, no, what I said to them, well, I can't remember most of the talk, but the part I do remember is the part that was most important to me. I think Berkeley, and like many other places, we try to get students from diverse backgrounds, and we have many students who come into graduate school who are the first in their family, students from low-income minority backgrounds, and so forth. And my colleagues, many of my colleagues, they're well-meaning, but they are less than honest with many of these students in working with them because they don't want to appear racist or they don't want to discourage. And I think what they fail to recognize is that the students are interpreting your behavior. And so there are students who are, and so basically what I said is we get in these students who are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and they leave with PhDs but feeling incompetent because they feel that the reason that they were not pushed in quite the same way is because the faculty think they can't do it and stuff. And you know, and stuff. And this was, and you know, I'd had a number of students who had come to me and complained about that, you know, and you know, he never read my thesis, he just wrote, you know, good job at the bottom of it and stuff. I remember one student said he kept it for a month and then it wasn't even bent at the staple and then signed off on it. And so those students, I mean, you know, they then interpreted it as a sense of their competence, not as a sense of the faculty's not engaging appropriately or being lazy or whatever. And so I felt it was important to call it out, and I had an audience that could do something about it, and so I called it out. I think to my, you know, it was surprising because after the talk, number of people came up to me, some faculty, but many of the staff, the student support staff, came up to me and told me, thank you for saying this because the students tell us this all the time. I think those of us who work with students, it's really incumbent upon us. And what I say to my students is those of you who are ethnic minorities, whatever, discrimination exists, you need to be at the top of your game when you leave here. Those of you who are white, everybody's trying to get a diverse faculty, so you need to be at the top of your game to be competitive. And then I say to them, I hope you know what that means. Everybody needs to be at the top of their game and stuff. All of you are going to be held to the highest standards. One of my mentors at Berkeley is Rona Weinstein, who's done a lot of work, did a lot of work on teacher expectations before she retired and stuff. And it's very clear that teacher expectations are one of the factors that play a big role in how students, especially minoritized under-income students, actually succeed or not.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. Now, it's not like you haven't experienced turbulence yourself. One of your accomplishments is having been editor of the top journal in the educational sciences, the Review of Educational Research. And you were editor when that journal turned AERA turned 100 years old. And to mark the occasion, you solicited 5 100-year reviews. You picked one on intellectual precocity when people weren't talking about intelligence. And especially in AERA, you look at the program, it's not even mentioned in education. Yes. And then fast forward 5 years to when Terman's study turned 100 years old, and the National Association for Gifted Children, their flagship journal, Gifted Child Quarterly, identifies guest editors to do a special issue on Terman. People like Dean Simonton are invited, Carol Houlihan, and NAGC decides to abort it because of some of Terman's early writings. He didn't have the right views by modern standards. And you wrote an eloquent letter protesting that. What do you say to people?
You know, I think, well, I guess the first thing I say is my mother has said to me that I have a martyr complex. She says, why does it have to be you? Let somebody else do it. I really do think that we are not going to move the field of knowledge forward if we don't consider all the knowledge. You know, some of Terman's early views certainly are racist by our standards. I would argue, though, that there are many of us who, if in fact we had grown up in that time, would have held similar views. I think, you know, we talk about cultural humility. I think we need to have humility of values as well, because I recognize that the context, I mean, some of the values that I may bring from Trinidad and Tobago are very different from the values in the United States and so forth. So specific to research, the research endeavor, how are we going to learn from the past if we don't engage with it and interrogate it? I mean, can you imagine doing a history of wars in the 20th century and Hitler's name not being mentioned because of what he did? You've got to engage with it, right? And so pretending that it didn't exist, so slavery, gave slaves skills, right? Instead of, as the current Florida history standards say, you've got to engage with the reality of what happened. When I did the review of educational research stuff, there was no blowback, actually. I thought there was going to be. I actually got no blowback from that at all. And in fact, 2 of the articles, one of them, which you kindly agreed to write, was on intellectual precocity and so forth. The other one was on acceleration and the kinds of things that benefit high performing students. And so fast forward to the NAGC article. So the Terman article, the call specifically asked for people who disagreed with Terman. So there was a broad call. The manuscripts were reviewed, they were accepted and stuff. They were typeset. It was just a matter of the things. I was actually asked, I'm not sure if you know this, but I was actually asked to do the introduction. I was asked to write the introduction. And I was working on it when they canceled the special issue. And one of the things I was trying to do, because as somebody who is a black male in America, I have had experiences that I would not have had in Trinidad, including kneeling at the corner of 24th and Telegraph, not too far from here in Oakland, surrounded by police with guns, Very different experience from, my father was a cop, so I grew up around cops, but that was a very, very different experience. But I was contrasting in my introduction, Terman and W.B. Du Bois. And because W. Du Bois is the first person to get a PhD from Harvard, first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard. When he went to do his work at the University of Pennsylvania, they didn't give him an office on campus. He was in a shed off of campus. And I was talking about the fact that not just about what Terman did, but the context of him as a white man in America at that same time, right, and stuff. And he ends up at Stanford. Du Bois doesn't get his office at Pennsylvania, he's in a shed. And so I was trying to deal with both the research side of it, but the social context in which these things occurred.
Right.
I think it would have set the stage for the manuscript, and I think that's what we need to do. And so by canceling that, people, don't get to learn any of it and to see that kind of contrast. They ended up having to publish the articles anyway, and they came out in 3 different issues instead of a special issue. So it's, the very thing they're saying they don't want to do, you've now spread across 3 issues instead of, I mean, it was just stupid. It was an emotional reaction, and I think, I just think it's unconscionable, and I said so in very clear terms, frank by name and frank by nature. So, which sometimes gets me into trouble as well, so.
Okay. Frank, what did you learn that you value the most being APA president? You just ended your term. What did that experience give you? That experience gave me, I think, more hope than I would have thought, given what's going on with the political polarization in the United States. APA, as you know, David, is an extremely political association and definitely left of center. And, which is fine. One of the things I was able to do was to get people who, when we passed the policy in support of Roe v. Wade, in support of a woman's right to choose, there were people on the council who, held a different point of view. And they wanted to be able to speak to council without fear of censure. And that happened last year. So in fact, I spent a good
3 to 4 months, preparing my opening statement to council where I talked about cultural humility and humility of values and so forth, and the importance of the American experiment not being about kicking out people who may be currently seen to be in the center and bringing in a new set of people, but making the center bigger so that we can all participate in it. And I was actually very fearful that I would get tremendous pushback from many people about that, and I did not get pushback, actually. And in fact, we had a very, very civil year on council. People whose views, minority views, were able to speak, felt heard and stuff, and said so. And so that really gave me a lot more hope because that if we are able to do that, if we're able to get other people in the broader society, then maybe we can get past this time that we are in. It's going to take, I think, some doing in some years, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. When I think of you, you've done so much in your career. You have twice as much as most academic psychologists have right now at this point in time. But what are your professional goals now? What do you want to do, Frank?
I'll give you the answer I gave to my best friend when I was 17 years old. I want to be happy. And I remember when I said that to him, he said, I'm worried about your soul. His father was a minister. And I said, are you saying that God doesn't want us to be happy? The thing about it is, my mom used to always say self-praise, no recommendation. I would say, I ran for APA president quite reluctantly. I had been being asked to run for about maybe 5 or 6 years when I did decide to run. I ran for president of the division that I ran. I was coerced into it. I much prefer conducting. I sing and I conduct. I much prefer conducting than singing, because my back is to the audience. I'm not necessarily one who needs to be out in front in the limelight. Mm-hmm. Bill is here. I would hope one of the things I tried to do when I was counselor is to go to the mic as little as possible, be clear, pithy, and then go back to my seat. So basically, there are lots of data. I want to get back to writing. One of the things that the last few years has done, it has taken up so much time. I have data up the wazoo. I mentioned, our time scale is translated into so many languages. We have not written up the data from Singapore. We've not written up the data from Iran. We've not written up the data from Peru. I'm lucky enough that my co-authors are being very patient with me. I'm lead on many of these things. I really like to continue to push my research agenda and see where that goes. So nothing more. I wouldn't mind winning the lottery, but give me more time to write if I could, if I'm independently wealthy. But yeah.
Frank, when you look back, who influenced you the most? Who are your role models?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think there are multiple people. One is my advisor, as I said, the one who taught me about the research agenda, Nadine Lambert. Rona Weinstein, who did the Teach Expectations work. Rona, in the class on prevention of school failure, she described it as the hardest class she had to teach. It was mixed. There was about half students of minorities, ethnic minorities, half who were not. And many of the people who were ethnic minorities were very focused. They apparently had an agenda of proving that, a point, and so they were often contrarian and so forth. And in fact, they were upset with me because I pointed out they made some statements that were not evidence-based, and I actually corrected them. And I was told after class, you're a foreigner in this country. We are trying to make a point, so you should just keep quiet and not say anything. But she engaged with the class, and by the end of the time, and she continued to work with everybody. So her passion, commitment, and an ability to try to bring these reviews together was really important. One of my mentors at Penn State, he taught me, he was very research agendas as well. He and his colleagues, his advisor, and 3 other people who were in school with him, he always published more than the rest of us in every single year. And what happens is that they all did intelligence research, and they each took a lead on a paper. They collected data together and took a lead on a paper. So if they did nothing else that year, they had 5 papers and stuff. It was just a little strategy, but it was, it helped me to multiply my effect. I've had wonderful collaborators over the course of my year, both in the time work, in the racial identity work, in the gifted and talented work. So I've had several of those people who have contributed to my development. I've been incredibly lucky, blessed, however you want to frame it, in terms of students and collaborators. And in fact, I think if I had more students who wanted to go into research positions, I guess that would be a regret. Many of my students, they want to go into practice. So they do wonderful dissertations, and then it's pulling teeth to get them to publish it because they go into a school system or they go into private, private practice, and that's fine. I think it's important for people to follow their passion, but I really wish more of them, because I think we are losing people who would be wonderful researchers,
Frank, what's your greatest professional regret?
My greatest professional regret, I don't know that I have one. I have been at only 2 institutions. When I was finishing at Berkeley, I interviewed at Penn State, and I have had an interview scheduled for University of Arizona, I believe, or Arizona State. But Arizona State wanted to interview after AERA, and Penn State interviewed before. And before AERA came, Penn State offered me the job. So I did 1 interview, and then I went to Penn State. When I was at Penn State, I did one, Lincoln, Nebraska recruited me. They after offered me a job, and I eventually decided not to go, and then I interviewed at Berkeley. So I've interviewed at 3 places in my career, and I've gotten the 3 jobs. And, everything has worked. I mean, maybe, greatest professional regret that I couldn't make some of the egos at Berkeley smaller, but.
Well, it doesn't, that's understandable. I mean, your career, what would you change, really?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think, I'd like to think perhaps, that in many ways, I'm a positive. I haven't, it's hard, I can't do my time aptitude test because I know what to put. But my mom, I think I had it at the end of my talk on Wednesday, the always aim for the stars. My mom, and I told you about he didn't do his best. At another time, I was taking her and a friend somewhere, and the friend asked, and they're in the back seat, mom didn't drive, and so I'm chauffeuring, and my mom's friend, Auntie Lucy, says to mom, what do you want Frank to do? I think I was maybe in the last year of secondary school or something, and I'm rolling my eyes thinking, oh, brother. And my mother said something incredible that I have never forgotten. She said, I really don't care what he does. And this is before she told me I hadn't done my best, right? So it's consistent. I don't care what he does, but whatever he does, he needs to do it well. So for example, if we are walking in the Capitol, and you say to me, look how clean this street is. It's cleaner than every other street. I need to be able to say with you with pride, my son cleans this street. And I remember thinking at the time, yeah, let me become a street cleaner and see what you think. But of course, as I grew older, the message,
right.
And I think that message, and it's a message that I got consistently from the people who were, I think, important mentors. I talked about professional mentors, but my secondary school music teacher I mentioned, she paid for she lent me money to pay for part of my first year, part of the tuition for my first year at Berkeley. But more importantly than that, she set this standard for the work that she did as a pianist in Trinidad with our choir. Our school, all-male school, became the first all-male school to win the Prime Minister's Trophy. For, the girls' schools typically won. The year our school won, the three choirs that were competing for the Prime Minister's Trophy were St. Mary's College Choir, which was my school choir, St. Joseph's Convent, that's our sister school across the street, and the combined choirs, and the male choir won. So I've gotten that message in music, and stuff, and so this idea of working hard and doing the best that you can, and accepting life for what it is something that has really been a part of my life since from the time I can remember. So.
Mm-hmm. Frank, I have one more question for you before we open it up to questions from the audience, because I know people are going to have questions for you. But one thing I know, a large number in the audience, we have students, we have postdocs, we have young academics. And what would your advice be to them to navigate this terrain that's out there? Especially, we both know that intelligence is far, far from everything. But it has validity in education, the world of work, and if you don't take it into account, you don't know what you have in other areas. And of course, we want to understand those other areas, as you have with your career. Right. But it's turbulent out there.
Right.
What would you say to them?
Yeah. I'd say a couple things. I think first and foremost is remember why you started doing this. I think people get into, if you are a postdoc, if you are a doctoral student in this area, this is something you care passionately about. You got here because this is something. And so to always keep that at your core, despite all of the slurs that are coming your way, right? I think you, to keep that at your core. I think I would encourage, also remind people that, it pays to always be professional. That, even when people are making ad hominem attacks, you don't need to descend to that level. You can respond courteously with data and so forth. I think it pays off in the long run. Certainly, I think it pays off in political terms. There was somebody who was, Melba Vasquez was APA president in 2012, I believe it was. In 2011, she and I argued vigorously on the floor of council about something. Then council voted, a decision was made, and we went on. In 2012, Melba Vasquez gave me a presidential citation, which I was very surprised about. And then she was my parliamentarian last year when I was president. That you don't personalize it. You don't have to get into that space. And the other thing I would say is do sort of impeccable work. So they may criticize you, they may not agree with you, but that your work then speaks for itself. Those I think are three things that I think would be really important. The musical analogy, there are two. One of the best adjudicators in Trinidad was being interviewed, and he was asked if there was a group that stood out, and he mentioned my school's choir, and the reporter said, why? And he said, because they're professionals. And the reporter said, they're not professionals, they don't get paid for what they do. And he said, a professional is not somebody who gets paid for what they do. A professional is somebody whose work never falls below a certain standard. That's what a professional is. And he said, when that choir came out on stage, it didn't always win, but I knew I was going to hear a good performance. Fast forward, in the 50th anniversary, I think it was, of the Sound of Music, they were interviewing Julie Andrews, who had been a child prodigy in singing. And Dan Sawyer asked her, I know you used to give the children who played the Van Trapp singers, you gave them pointers and stuff, and you gave them some advice. Do you remember what that is? And Julie Andrews laughed and said yes, and Dan Sawyer, would you share it with us? And Julie Andrews says, an amateur rehearses so they get it right. A professional rehearses so they do not get it wrong. And I tell this to my students every year. So do good work at the basis of it. It doesn't mean the study is not going to have limitations and so forth, but do work that you're proud of and that will stand up next to anything else. And that is the foundation on which you can move forward.
That's very good advice, Frank. It's a great way to end this interview, Frank. This has just been wonderful. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm tremendously honored to have been invited to do this.
Okay, I think we have time for some questions now. I'm going to turn it over.
Beautiful, thank you. I have a question. Something that you mentioned about bringing gifted pedagogy to the regular classroom, and clearly from the Chancellors Award, I would assume you also bring that into the university classroom as well. So what is something practical that we can do from the lessons you've learned in our own courses to sort of emulate this approach?
I think, I don't think it's anything special. I think it's what we do with our best students, right? One of the things we know from the ed psych literature is that things like the wait time when you ask a question for the top kids is longer than the wait time that you have when you ask kids who you think don't know the answer. You move on more quickly. So it's taking those good practices. The nature of the homework that you give, right? Giving problems that may not have a solution. I think somebody mentioned it, I guess, in one of the talks, Vygotsky, I think it was Camilla, pushing the zone of proximal development, right? That's what we need to do. And so it means knowing the students in your classroom. I'm a great believer in assessing, when I taught K-12, you want to get a sense of where the kids are because there are going to be skill sets and different weaknesses and so forth. And so you want to get a sense of what that is so that when, in fact, you are pushing them, you know sort of where to target that push. All of those kinds of things. The other thing I was lucky enough, when my master's thesis was, as I said, was in educational psychology, and my advisor, his expertise was teaching effectiveness at the university level, so and so forth. One of the experimental studies that he did is actually took a group of university professors, random assignment, and the treatment group, he hired an actor to teach them things like pacing, modulation of tone, how to use pauses effectively. Things that actors use on the stage that, keep us on our seat. And those, not only did those the students in those classrooms get higher scores, grades at the end of the semester, they reported that they enjoyed the class more, they were more likely to want to take a class in that subject and so forth. So, enthusiasm of, use of humor in teaching, clarity, right? And clarity not defined behaviorally. Multiple examples, concrete examples, and so forth. Interaction, knowing students' names, even if it's a big class, knowing something about them. And so there are a number of those things that we know are things that kids at the high end typically get, that oftentimes kids who are less well prepared don't get. And so, but doing that with all of them, and of course, having high expectations for everyone.
Professor Worrell, thank you again for being here. I sure appreciate having you here throughout the conference. You, in your initial presentation a couple days ago, you addressed, and you and I talked about this a little bit, factors that aren't necessarily related to cognition, to intelligence, but you're looking at hope now. Beyond how those personality traits or factors play into determining how a person, what that person is and becomes, do you see any way that they also impact the cognition that an individual is experiencing, that person has?
Right, yeah. Thank you for that question. I'd say a couple things. First, the short answer is yes. I mentioned ethnic identity, I mentioned the time stuff that I do. I actually think that identity is a constellation of factors. I think your IQ, so your G plus your non-G factors. I think these things interact in interesting ways, right? The idea, I think a lot of people have tried to use, for instance, growth mindset and grit as the solutions to a problem. And I think the reason that they have failed is because they're focused on them as singular constructs. I think that for one kid it may be growth mindset, another kid it may be grit, another kid it may be autonomy, competence, the SDT, the motivation frameworks. And I think that these things play out in dynamic ways that we don't understand, right? So as a teacher, you have a group of kids in front of you in the classroom, and you have got, part of your job is to suss out how to connect with each of those kids, and what works for one student may not work for another. And I think that G plays into that, so that they actually, that there are sort of these ongoing interactions, right? So this is my pet theory, right? So no data here, but and I think we see it with our doctoral students as well, right? Sometimes more clearly, there's some of them who come in who are very quantitative, some who come in and can write very well, and so forth. But they come in and they're in a competitive environment. At Berkeley, they come in and they've been valedictorian here or whatever, and they've never been pushed. Their zone of proximity, they've never been stretched. And they think, oh my God, I've lost all my smarts, right? Because I'm being challenged. And so approaching that student is a very different thing than approaching the student who comes in thinking, well, I've arrived. I don't, give me the dissertation, right? I don't have to do anything more. You've got to approach those students differently. And both of them are coming in with high intellect, right, and stuff. But the way that you interact with them, I think, has to be tailored. And so I really do think that it's really, that learning is much more complicated. And I am one of the people, I'm a great believer in G, but in non-G as well. And I think our expertise, we focus, we try to learn about the one. And I think where the field needs to go, education more broadly, but psychology and learning, is how do these things dynamically interact. I think we are a long ways away from there.
Frank? We've talked a lot about your vocation, but what about your avocation? Talk about the role of music in your life, and how has that influenced your vocation and your own talent development process? Because obviously you're a very, very accomplished singer, and I like to think about how you balance those parts of your life to give yourself, so that you feel that you're flourishing and that you, as you said, that you have happiness.
Right. Thanks, Camilla. My brother would snort if he hear you say I was an accomplished singer. He takes great pride in saying, "You're trying to sing again, are you?" But the music, I think it's really important. And I'm not, my mom wanted me to be a priest. I think the one thing she wanted more than the fact of the PhD, she would have settled for Father Frank, which was not going to happen. But I think it's important, and I'm not meaning this in a religious sense, I think it really is important to, in addition to feeding your intellect, to feed your soul in some sense. And for me, music plays that role. I have been lucky enough to have been involved in music, from elementary school into secondary school. And it's brought rewards. In 1979, the Trinidad and Tobago government sent the combined choirs, St. Mary's and St. Joe's combined choirs, to represent Trinidad and Tobago at the Festival of Youth and Music in Austria, Vienna, Austria. And that was a wonderful experience in and of itself. And we got to go sing in the second largest basilica in Europe. It's in Mariazell. And we had prepared an Argentinian folk mass in Spanish. And they are doing high mass in German, and then we are doing the parts of the mass in Spanish. And it was just, one of those things. I've taken 3 choirs back to Trinidad on tour. When I was a grad student at Berkeley, I took voice lessons from a member of the voice faculty there. And the day before my PhD graduation, I did a graduation recital. When I was at Penn State, I sang with the Penn State Glee Club, became the associate director there, even though I was not a faculty member in the music department. And I actually got to take formal conducting lessons. The head of choral music they let me audit the advanced and intermediate and advanced conducting classes. I've been conducting for years, but I'd had no formal training. So I've been able to have music as part of what I do throughout. And so it's, on the one hand, it's been there as a support, as part of the milieu. On the other hand, you get to see people who think they can't sing, and 2 years later, they're doing a solo. So you get to see development and stuff, and because if people are given a long enough, sometimes ramp, they can accomplish far more than they thought they could. And sometimes, school, the school year, sometimes for some kids, is not a long enough ramp to get to the next level. That doesn't mean they cannot get there. So I think it's informed my thinking about talent development in many ways. So, I mean, it's just been sort of a constant foundation. And the other aspect of it, I think, that has been really important to me, and this came early, was, as I said, watching my music teacher was Trinidad's top pianist. But when she had a concert coming up with a singer or something like that, she would practice for hours, right? And we are not hearing errors, but she's hearing, she, again, not so that you get it right, so that you do not get it wrong. So that's, understanding what that meant. I mean, I didn't have that language yet, but that's what was going on.